Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, February 1st, 2024. Happy Black History Month. Today we are going to be taking a look at the 2024 Ohio Senate race and new polls that have been released from the state from Emerson College that seem to suggest good news for Democrats ahead of this upcoming tumultuous election year. Now, the Ohio Senate race is one that stands at the center point of this upcoming election cycle because of how important it is for control of the United States Senate. This race has practically always been competitive, as Ohio has historically been a swing state, but in more recent years has moved further and further alongside the right in terms of Republican ideology and has been voting pretty heavily in favor of Republican candidates up and down the ballot. But when it comes down to this specific Senate race, Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown, the Democratic incumbent, has lucked out election after election. His most recent victory was in the 2018 Senate elections, in which he won by his margin of around 6 points across this state. This came shortly after Donald Trump's victory, around 9 points across the state of Ohio, and what was pretty substantial in favor of the Democrats. And so looking at the 2024 Ohio presidential race, Donald Trump and Joe Biden are in for a rematch, and the numbers look nearly identical. Donald Trump won this state by 8.1% in the last election, and he's on track to win it in this one by an average of 9.5%, and according to Emerson College, by around 11 points. And thus, that brings me back to the Ohio Senate polls that show that Sherrod Brown defeats the Republican frontrunner, Bernie Moreno, who right now is at a point where he is ahead of the other contenders after receiving an endorsement from President Donald Trump. But right now, Sherrod Brown leading by 2 points isn't this overwhelmingly large display of confidence on its own. But when compared to the general election numbers, I would argue that they do show some major movements in terms of support across this battleground state. If Donald Trump is leading by 11 and the same electorate shows Sherrod Brown up by 2, it shows some massive levels of crossover support and also some reluctancy to support Bernie Moreno, who right now comes in again as the GOP frontrunner. Now, I will say there is a chance that he does not end up winning the nomination. It doesn't really change the way we look at the polls in this state because what we saw from Emerson College is that also Sherrod Brown does maintain his lead against every other candidate. Frank LaRose, who is the incumbent Secretary of State, and Matt Dolan, who is a state senator in Ohio. But right now it looks like that Moreno is on track for potentially a victory here. He's up by 1 point across the state, but with this Trump endorsement, as we have seen with people like Ted Budd and Herschel Walker and other candidates across the country in 2022, and now in this upcoming election, they benefit from the Trump endorsement a little bit later in the game than when the initial endorsement really comes in to play. A lot of the times you will see candidates sit on this endorsement and end up playing it in ads and in flyers and whatever it might be by the time the primary season rolls around, and you actually see that really boosting their numbers and their chances at winning the nomination outright. And regardless, if you take a look at the switch in support, Frank LaRose, who had practically been the only statewide elected official running, and also somebody who had been backed by the majority of the endorsements at the time before Donald Trump weighed in on this race, you can see that Moreno went from 7 to 7 to 10 to 22. So you're seeing a huge jump up in terms of support, one that I think will continue in terms of momentum, but like I told you, it really doesn't change in terms of overall support between Sherrod Brown and any of his Republican contenders. But I think I look at these numbers and say, that Sherrod Brown is certainly, not going to lose this race almost immediately. I think when we look at the Senate map, we already know that at least one state is going to flip red, and that is the state of West Virginia. In 2018, went to Joe Manchin, the incumbent Democrat, by a margin of around 3 points. He announced now that he's going to be retiring, and thus, Democrats have no shot at maintaining that Senate seat. It's a state Donald Trump won by around 40 points. And so you move over to the rest of the country and you are down to 50-50, which means that if President Biden wins re-election, which right now seems to be up in the air, Democrats could maintain Senate control in the same way they did in 2020 in a 50-50 tie, with Vice President Harris breaking that tie in favor of the Democrats. And so this 50-50 tie here really does matter because every single state from here on out matters to the ultimate importance, right? You look at all of these states that are competitive: Montana, Arizona, Nevada, Texas, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. The overwhelming majority of these states are democratically held. In fact, only one of them that I mentioned, Texas, is held by Republicans currently. And so when you see that and recognize the Democrats are going to be playing defense all across the country, quite literally, it really puts this into perspective that this is a Republican-slated map. This map is meant to produce a Republican majority. And obviously it wasn't written in that way, but the dynamics at play with the 2024 election cycle coming up, with the incumbents and the retirements that are taking place across the country, this map realistically should be an easy GOP pickup. And Ohio and Montana are going to be prime targets. But this video's focus is on Ohio, and like I said, this is a state that Donald Trump won in the last election by a margin of around 8 points. I think that really also puts things back into perspective too, because it tells us that Donald Trump in his last election was able to win by nearly the exact same margin he won by in 2016. No reason to suggest that it might be different, honestly, in 2024 unless it's even further in favor of Donald Trump. Because in between 2016 and 2022, the only major Democratic victory was Sherrod Brown, and even then, that margin was reduced down to around 6 points. When you take a look at the governor's race in 2022, you saw that although you had Mike DeWine winning it by 3 points in 2018, he won it by over 20 in 2022. When you look at the Senate race in 2022 in Ohio, J.D. Vance, a lackluster Republican opponent by every metric. Tim Ryan, a good Democratic candidate by, every metric. You look at these numbers and say, J.D. Vance still won by 6 points, which means that Ohio, at its fundamentals, is still out of reach for Democrats, unless it's Sherrod Brown on the ticket. And so I think looking at the 2022 results also will just help us realize, too, that, again, Ohio is a state that Democrats have really been trying to crack, even with the strongest candidates over the past couple of election cycles. I mean, even the polls had suggested that Joe Biden would do significantly better than Hillary Clinton in Ohio, and then by the end of Election Day, the movement was less than 0, right? And so when you see, or less than 1, and so when you see those numbers and you see the fact that Republicans have really maintained this dominance in this state, it really calls into question, does Sherrod Brown have what it takes to win the upcoming election? And like I said very early on, it looks like he might. And I think this is really, really surprising, too, because I was expecting that with the Trump endorsement that Bernie Moreno would be shoveled up into where, Donald Trump is nationwide, where Donald Trump is statewide. I think seeing the difference of 47 drop down to 37, despite them being in this hypothetical, the Democratic nominee, the Republican nominee, as distinguished in this poll, really, again, tells us everything we need to know about Sherrod Brown's ability to win over crossover support. If 2016 wasn't good enough of an example to show you that Sherrod Brown absolutely can win over support, 2016 Trump plus 8, 2018, Brown plus 6, that's around a 14-point shift, nearly identical to what we are seeing right now, with Sherrod Brown up by 2, according to Emerson College, but on the battleground general election front on the presidential, Trump wins by 11. Around a 13-point swing. And Data for Progress did a poll back in October and November that showed Trump up by 8 statewide, that showed Sherrod Brown up by 3. That's an 11-point swing. And so these swings here seem to be, again, very similar to where they were in previous elections that allowed Sherrod Brown to win. And I think that is equally important to recognize, too. That while there is a history of it, too, the polls are suggesting that it is also happening again. That what Sherrod Brown had done before to win is also happening now. And so I really think when we look at the 2024 Senate map, Ohio is very, very much in play, especially now that Donald Trump has weighed in on this race and endorsed, arguably, the worst candidate he could have in this state. I think Bernie Moreno, who comes into this as someone with no major political experience, with the most scandals, with an association to many of the Republican Party's major pitfalls, things related to the insurrection, things related to conspiracy theories, things related to extremism and the alt-right. I mean, that is him embodied in the fullest extent in this election cycle, and yet Donald Trump says, I want him. And I think we all remember exactly what happens when Donald Trump makes the wrong choice in many battleground states. He made the right one in Ohio, but he wasn't running against, arguably, a popular Democratic incumbent. But you know where he was running against a popular Democratic incumbent? Look no further than Arizona with Mark Kelly, who defeated the Trump-endorsed Blake Masters, who won his nomination largely with the Trump endorsement by around 5 points. Look no further than Georgia with Herschel Walker, who was propped up against Raphael Warnock, a popular Democratic incumbent in potentially what was going to be a red wave year if many of these states and many of these Republican, parties and Donald Trump himself had not made major missteps in terms of endorsements. But in Georgia, Herschel Walker, who Donald Trump cleared the field for in April of 2021, before Herschel Walker even announced that he was interested in running. He endorsed Herschel Walker, posted on Truth Social, "Run, Herschel, run," and he did, and he lost. And the field was clear. Nobody dared to challenge Herschel Walker seriously across the state. And thus Republicans lost his seat for another 6 years. In Pennsylvania, with Republican Senator Pat Toomey, who now is being seen as a rhino by many Republicans, Dr. Oz came into this race. Yes, you remember him, the celebrity Dr. Oz came into this race. It's almost laughable at this point, looking back on this Senate race, about how really, it should have been obvious, even for me who predicted this race was going red, how obvious it should have been that this race simply wasn't going to go to the GOP. But John Fetterman, the lieutenant governor at the time, who maintained a very stable presence across the state, was running against a slate of Republican candidates there. John Fetterman, who had practically always been the favorite to win the primary race against Conor Lamb. You see here that Dr. Oz was faced up against candidates like Kathy Barnett, Carla Sands, right? You also have Dave McCormick, who's now the front runner in the 2024 race, also slated to lose that race. Dr. Oz was endorsed by Trump. They end up losing, right? So you have Pennsylvania, you have Georgia, you have Arizona, and many other states too. Across the country, many other states were Donald Trump's endorsement. In New Hampshire too, Don Bolduc, who got the endorsement. Don Bolduc, I believe that's how you say it actually. I've been incorrectly saying it for quite some time now. But regardless though, Donald Trump's endorsement was the kiss of death to many of these candidates. And I think it very well could be in the state of Ohio, because Democrats were rejoicing when Donald Trump made this decision to endorse arguably the worst candidate on the ballot here. I think looking at the GOP primary, you already have people here who have political experience, who have the ability to win statewide and have won statewide, who knows this state in and out and has aligned themselves with the Republican ideology very, very intensely. And I think that Bernie Moreno also, his stances on abortion just simply aren't in line with the way that Ohio recently voted on the abortion referendum in the state, in which they passed a constitutional right to abortion in this state. And so when I see this, when I see all of these things falling into place, it reminds me of the perfect storm that Democrats got back in 2022. Although the national numbers and some of these statewide numbers don't look phenomenal, at the top of the ticket in many of the down ballot races and many of the top ticket races back in 22, they ended up doing a lot better for Democrats than the polls had predicted, than the pundits had predicted, than practically anyone had predicted. Because what you saw was that Democrats turned out their base largely on this issue of abortion. And I can guarantee it, they will do the same thing this election cycle. Because they have cracked into the code that worked for Republicans for 50 years when Roe v. Wade was put into law, put into precedent by the United States Supreme Court. Republicans spent 49 years campaigning on a pro-life agenda, campaigning on putting in politicians who are pro-life. Even if the majority of the country didn't agree with them, that was what kept them motivated. And now Democrats have their motivating factor because of Dobbs v. Jackson. I think you're starting to see a real flip here, where even in off-year special elections, or just general off-year elections, or even the 2022 midterms, there was a direct impact of the Dobbs v. Jackson decision. A direct impact that I think will be further realized in this election cycle as well. One that I think will benefit Sherrod Brown, especially that Bernie Moreno has taken more conservative stances on abortion than Donald Trump himself. And so that is certainly a reason why I think you see him dipping in support. I think also a good chunk of the electorate is just simply undecided as to who they are going to vote for, which again further is good news for Democrats, because it means here that voters aren't just shutting out Sherrod Brown because he is a Democrat alone. You are talking about a Trump plus 11 electorate here that can't even give the Republicans an upper hand when it comes down to the Ohio Senate race. There are clearly voters here that voted for, Trump in the first question, or said they were going to vote for Trump in the first question and vote for Brown in the second one. And that is exactly what Sherrod Brown needs to win, because he, unfortunately for him, is running alongside the same ballot, a similar ballot that we will likely see something like 2016 again. 2012 is really, really in the distant past. I don't see a possibility that Joe Biden wins this state unless, hell freezes over. But right now we're looking more similarly to a 2016 type of victory for Donald Trump, which will make winning difficult. But I think looking further and looking out ahead into the future, Sherrod Brown has a pathway to victory. He is by no means, DOA, and I think this Senate race will be of the utmost importance in this election cycle, and Democrats and Republicans will be vying very heavily for it because it truly will determine the balance of power in the 2024 upcoming Congress. And so I think all eyes focused on Ohio, on Montana, on these two states, the only two states that Democrats are defending that Donald Trump won in the last election cycle, and arguably by a pretty significant amount. And I think what we see here in these early polls is good news for Democrats. The question is now, can they maintain it between now and November? So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.